Have you ever wondered why some people linger in your memory long after they're gone? Not because they tried to be perfect, not because they were the loudest in the room, but because they were real. There's something unforgettable about those who dare to show up fully, flawed, honest, grounded. And when they leave, it's not drama you remember. It's the silence they mastered, the peace they carried, the way they never begged to stay because they knew their presence was already enough. This video will show you exactly how to become that person, the one they can't forget, the one they'll regret letting go. Not out of bitterness, but because you finally remembered who you are. These are 7 paradoxical Stoic traits that transform you into someone unforgettable. Someone who no longer performs, no longer waits for permission, and no longer dims their light just to be accepted. So if you've ever felt overlooked, discarded, or underestimated, this isn't about revenge. This is about evolution. The kind that doesn't need to be announced, just lived. If that sounds like the path you're ready to walk, make sure you subscribe and hit that like button. Let's begin.
Number 1.
They stop performing and embrace radical authenticity. There's a specific kind of emptiness that grows when your life becomes a stage. You smile when you're exhausted. You agree when you want to walk away. You shrink parts of yourself just to make others more comfortable. And somewhere along the way, you forget what your real voice even sounds like. That's the cost of constant performance. But unforgettable people reject that life. They stop editing themselves for approval. They stop shaping their truth to fit in rooms that never saw them clearly in the first place. Instead, they live with radical honesty, not to be provocative, but to be whole. That's what makes them powerful. The Stoics called this living in accordance with nature. Epictetus wrote, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. Not what others want you to do, not what the crowd rewards, but what aligns with your inner character. Because when your actions match your soul, you become unshakable." Here's the paradox. The more you try to be impressive, the more invisible you become. But the moment you stop pretending, even if you're imperfect, you stand out, because realness is rare. Most people are exhausted actors, but when they see someone drop the mask, they feel it. They remember it. Keanu Reeves is a living example. Despite fame and tragedy, he moves through life quietly, without trying to impress. He doesn't perform a character off-screen. He doesn't chase the spotlight. And that quiet humility, that refusal to fake, makes him deeply respected. Not because he demands attention, but because he lives aligned. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius said, "The approval of 10,000 men is nothing if I do not approve of myself." That's the core. If you live for applause, your peace will always depend on noise. But if you live from inner clarity, even silence affirms your worth. And let's tell the truth. Most people perform because they're afraid their real self won't be loved. So they adapt, they blend, they decorate their truth. But eventually the performance drains them. And worse, it disconnects them from the kind of love they actually want. The kind built on truth, not illusion. That's why this is so powerful. When you stop performing, some people will leave. Let them. The ones who only love the character won't recognize the real you. And that's not rejection, it's revelation. When you're real, you don't attract the most people. You attract the right ones, the ones who see you and stay. And over time, something deep shifts. You begin to speak less, but your words carry weight. You start to walk into rooms without needing validation. Your presence becomes quieter, but more commanding, because you're no longer trying to be liked. You're just being, and that's unforgettable. Radical authenticity doesn't mean exposing every emotion or announcing every belief. It means living from a place that no longer needs to be edited. It means saying no when it would be easier to say yes just to be liked. It means owning your voice, shaky or strong, and standing still in it. So, if you want to be remembered, not for being flawless, but for being real, then stop performing. Let people feel your presence unfiltered. Speak when it matters. Walk away when it costs your soul. Strip away the roles that were never truly yours, and let your truth echo. Not because you forced it, but because you finally let it rise. That's how you become the one they regret letting go. Not because you perform perfectly, but because you reminded them what authenticity really looks like.
Number 2.
They cultivate inner strength, not external validation. There's a quiet slavery that most people never notice. It doesn't come with chains, but with likes, compliments, and approval. It looks like success, but it feels like dependence. Because as long as your self-worth swings on someone else's reaction, you're not free, you're leased. Unforgettable people don't live that way. They don't outsource their worth. They don't need applause to breathe. Instead, they build something deeper, what the Stoics called fortitude, not the appearance of strength, actual inner sturdiness, calm under pressure, peace without permission. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." Even as emperor surrounded by flattery, he had to remind himself not to live for external validation. If someone with that much power struggled with this, what does it say about us? Most people live in reaction. They post for attention, they speak to be liked, they perform peace instead of practicing it. But the moment you stop needing validation and start developing your own alignment, you step into something untouchable. Think of Dave Chappelle. At the peak of his career, he walked away from a $50 million contract. Why? Because staying meant compromising what mattered. He didn't leave to make a statement. He left to protect his integrity. That kind of move, calm, clear, and costly, is unforgettable. Not because it grabbed headlines, but because it showed he couldn't be bought. Now compare that to most people's definition of strength. Followers, attention, likes. But none of that lasts because it's built on perception, not principle. And when perception shifts, the foundation collapses. That's why so many people feel successful and hollow at the same time. Epictetus, a man born into slavery who became a Stoic teacher, said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Why? Because truth often looks strange from the outside. But if you're always decorating your decisions, always needing others to agree, you're not strong, you're still performing. Stoicism teaches you to reclaim your inner court, to ask, what does my reason say is right? Not what will get me praise. This is how real strength is formed, not in volume, but in clarity, not in how many follow you, but in how deeply you follow your values. This kind of strength doesn't need defending. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand to be seen. It shows up quietly, consistently, and with a kind of grounded energy that others feel more than they understand. When someone has built their identity on truth instead of trends, you can feel the difference. It's not that these people don't care at all. They care deeply, but what they care about has shifted. From being liked to being aligned, from being admired to being real. Over time, that quiet strength becomes impossible to fake. When others panic in rejection, you remain still. When they react, you reflect. Not because you're cold, but because you're anchored. You've trained your mind not to obey every emotion. You've learned to act from principle, not impulse. Eventually, people start to feel the difference. You walk into rooms with calm, you leave without explaining, you say less, but it lands deeper. Not because you're withholding, but because you no longer perform for approval, you lead with alignment. And here's the paradox. When you stop needing validation, you become worthy of it. When you stop chasing attention, you begin attracting respect. And when your strength comes from within, the outside world loses its power over you. That's what unforgettable people do. They don't force influence, they become it, by refusing to be owned by anything external. Not applause, not opinion, not image. That's how they move. Not loud, not desperate, just solid, just rooted, just enough.
Number 3.
They master a quiet presence, not loudness. There's a kind of power that doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, doesn't chase, and doesn't try to be impressive, and yet it fills the room. That's the paradox of a quiet presence. In today's noisy world, we're taught to believe that influence comes from volume, from being the loudest voice, the brightest light, the most visible figure. But those who truly leave a lasting impression are often the ones who say the least. They don't force impact, they become impact. The Stoics understood this well, Seneca wrote, "Let your character speak louder than your words." In other words, be so anchored in your values that your presence communicates more than your mouth ever could. A quiet presence isn't about hiding. It's not passivity. It's a deep stillness that commands more attention than chaos ever could. It's the rare peace people feel in a storm and remember long after it ends. Fred Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers, is a perfect example. He didn't enter rooms to dominate. He wasn't charismatic in the conventional sense, but he was present, deeply, fully, calmly. He wasn't trying to entertain or persuade. He was just being soft-spoken, attentive, unwavering in values. And that's why people still talk about him decades later. Not because he shouted, but because his silence had meaning. That's the key. Loudness demands space. Quiet presence creates space. And in that space, people begin to listen, not just to you, but to themselves. That's what unforgettable people do. They help others feel more human simply by being fully human themselves. Now, the modern world doesn't reward that. It rewards performance. It rewards noise. It tells you to speak fast, sell harder, be seen. So when someone walks into a room without performing, without pushing, without explaining, they disrupt the script. They unsettle something. And it's that calm disruption that people don't forget. In Stoic terms, this is the embodiment of ataraxia, a serene clarity that can't be taken from you. It's what happens when you stop letting the world stir your spirit. When you're no longer rattled by opinions or pulled into chaos, you become a mirror. You reflect the world, but you're not absorbed by it. This kind of presence isn't built overnight. It comes from restraint, from knowing you could speak but choosing not to, from knowing you could perform but refusing to, from seeing through the illusion that noise equals meaning, and choosing instead to let your stillness speak. Consider the artist Rick Rubin, known for producing some of the most iconic music across generations. He rarely speaks during sessions. Sometimes he just sits, listens, observes. And yet artists say that his presence alone changes everything. He's not controlling the room, he's holding it. That's what presence does when it's real. It grounds, it centers, it leaves fingerprints on the moment, without forcing anything. And here's the paradox. The less you try to be remembered, the more unforgettable you become. Because while people may forget your words, they rarely forget your energy, especially the kind that made them feel seen, safe, and calm. That's the kind of presence people grieve when it's gone. So if you want to lead, not through volume, but through gravity, practice presence, practice restraint, speak only when it improves the silence, and walk into every space as if you already know. I don't need to raise my voice. I am the voice. Quiet presence doesn't just change how others see you. It changes how you see the world. It sharpens your perception. It deepens your choices. It gives you room to listen, to feel, and to respond from a place that's no longer reactive, but intentional. That's the power of quiet presence. It's not what you say, it's what you are. when you say nothing at all.
Number 4.
They embrace wholeness, not perfection. We live in a world obsessed with flawless appearances, perfect bodies, perfect careers, perfect relationships. Every scroll, every ad, every polished photo whispers the same lie, that you are not enough until you're edited. But those who leave a deep and lasting mark on us, they don't pretend to be perfect. They allow themselves to be whole. Perfection is an illusion that fragments us. It demands we slice away the parts that don't fit the script, our fears, our doubts, our contradictions. But wholeness is the radical act of standing in your full humanity, not as a brand, but as a being. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung called this process individuation, the integration of all parts of the self, especially the ones we're taught to hide. And the Stoics, centuries earlier, shared a similar view. They didn't believe in perfection, they believed in alignment. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one." He never said a flawless man, he said a good one, a present one, a whole one. And here's the truth. The people who impact us most are not the polished ones. They're the ones who gave us permission to be human. They weren't always composed, but they were always real. Think about the people who made you feel safe, understood, less alone. Were they perfect? Or were they honest? Take Robin Williams, one of the most beloved entertainers in modern memory. Behind his comedy was a complex inner life, one filled with struggle, with contradiction, with sorrow. And yet that very depth is what made his laughter matter. It wasn't hollow, it wasn't a mask, it was a bridge. Because he brought all of himself, joy, pain, wit, ache, to every role. And in doing so, he reminded millions of people, you can be both broken and brilliant. Stoicism doesn't tell you to be perfect. It tells you to be self-aware. It tells you to take responsibility for your internal world, not to erase your flaws, but to understand them, to integrate them, Seneca wrote. No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself. Wholeness doesn't come from hiding weakness. It comes from letting life carve you, in choosing to remain open. This shift from perfection to wholeness is where true confidence is born. Because when you stop pretending, you stop fearing exposure. There's nothing left to hide. And in that nakedness, there's freedom, there's clarity, there's power. So many people walk around with shame, pretending they have it all together, when what they really need is to be seen as they are, not as their highlight reel, but as their unedited truth. That's why embracing wholeness is so magnetic. It breaks the spell of comparison. It invites connection. And over time, something remarkable happens. The parts of you that once felt like liabilities become doorways to compassion. Your scars become stories. Your missteps become mirrors. Your contradictions become proof that you're not here to be ideal. You're here to be honest. The Stoics knew that virtue wasn't about image. It was about practice, not about pretending to be above pain, but about walking through it with courage, about failing forward, about showing up anyway. Wholeness says, I have nothing to prove, I just want to be aligned. And that kind of energy, it heals people around you without a word. So if you want to be unforgettable, let go of perfection. Let people feel your depth, your mess, your contradiction, not recklessly, but truthfully. Because the ones who stay with us are never the ones who had it all together. They're the ones who made us feel like it was okay not to. That's what makes someone unforgettable. Not their flawlessness, but their wholeness. The way they showed up without pretending. The way they lived in alignment, not for applause.
Number 5.
They practice unapologetic emotional honesty. In a culture that rewards polished mass, emotional honesty can feel like a threat. We're told to be positive, pleasant, and strong. Code words that often mean don't feel too deeply, don't speak too vulnerably, don't make others uncomfortable. But the people who truly stay with us, long after they leave, are the ones who didn't filter their humanity. They felt fully, and they didn't apologize for it. Emotional honesty doesn't mean emotional chaos. It doesn't mean losing control or oversharing. It means being in contact with your inner life and refusing to bury it to make others comfortable. That's what unforgettable people do. They cry without shame. They laugh without restraint. They name their grief not to be dramatic, but to be real. And in doing so, they give others silent permission to do the same. The Stoics didn't ask us to suppress emotion. That's a misunderstanding. They asked us to examine it, to sit with it, to own it without being ruled by it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself," meaning, allow yourself to feel, but guide your action through clarity, not impulse. Don't hide from the storm inside you. Learn to observe it, and when it's time, speak from that truth, not in anger, not in fear, but in presence. Think of Maya Angelou, her poetry, her voice, her presence. They weren't sterile or polished. They were alive. She spoke from her wounds and her wisdom. She shared her trauma, her joy, her rage, and her grace. She didn't offer a performance. She offered a mirror, and millions of people saw themselves more clearly because of it. That's emotional honesty, not loud, but unshakably true. Most people fear that if they show their feelings, they'll be seen as weak, dramatic, or unstable. So they armor up, smile when they want to scream, shrug when they want to collapse. But what they don't realize is that holding back costs more energy than letting go. It creates distance, disconnection, and eventually people forget who you are, because even you lose touch with it. Unapologetic honesty doesn't mean you wear your emotions for display. It means you're no longer ashamed of having them. When something hurts, you admit it. When something matters, you say so. When someone crosses a line, you speak, not to provoke, but to protect your peace. That kind of clarity, it's rare and unforgettable. Here's where Stoicism sharpens the practice. It tells us to feel with structure, to allow the emotion, but ask, what is this teaching me? Instead of numbing, we investigate. Instead of venting, we refine. Emotional honesty, when guided by reason, becomes a superpower. You can walk into a room and feel everything, but still choose your response with calm precision. Now think about the people you've admired most, not because they look stoic, but because they were transparent in truth. The ones who could say, "I'm hurting," or "I'm afraid," without collapsing into it. The ones who stood in their story without flinching. That's not weakness, that's mastery. When you practice emotional honesty, your presence shifts. You no longer need to explain everything. People feel your clarity. You attract those who value truth over comfort, depth over performance. And here's the paradox. When you stop apologizing for your feelings, you become more emotionally available, not less. People feel safer around you because you're not hiding behind a mask. You're here, fully, honestly. So if you want to be unforgettable, stop polishing your heart until it's unrecognizable. Let people feel your real tone. Let your words shake if they must. Let your silence speak if it needs to. Because what people remember isn't how composed you looked. It's how true you were. That's emotional honesty, and that's what lingers. Number 6, they live by self-examination, not on autopilot. Most people drift through life. They follow routines, chase rewards, and react to circumstances without ever asking why. They confuse movement with meaning. But the people who truly stand out, the ones we remember, the ones we regret losing, they live differently. They don't operate on autopilot. They examine everything, This kind of awareness begins with one question. Where am I pretending? Pretending to be fine, pretending to care, pretending to want what I no longer need. Most people are so committed to being liked, approved of, or successful, they forget to ask whether the life they're building is actually aligned. Self-examination breaks that spell. It interrupts the performance and brings you back to the truth. This principle is ancient. Socrates famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." The Stoics took that seriously, not just as a quote, but as a daily practice. Marcus Aurelius kept a journal, not to impress anyone, but to wrestle with his own thoughts, to question his motives, to look in the mirror, not for vanity, but for alignment. Seneca wrote letters to friends reflecting on his actions and errors, not to boast, but to refine his conduct. The goal was never perfection. It was clarity. To examine your life is to ask uncomfortable questions. Why do I keep repeating this pattern? Why does this relationship drain me? Why am I silent when I should speak? These questions are hard, but they're necessary, because what you don't face, you can't free yourself from. Think of Michelle Obama, her memoir. Becoming is a living testament to the power of self-inquiry. Throughout her story, she doesn't claim to have all the answers. Instead, she reflects on what shaped her, where she compromised too much, where she reclaimed her voice, and what it took to become more of herself over time. She evolved by asking better questions, not performing better roles. That's the paradox. The people who seem most solid, most rooted, most present aren't perfect. They're simply willing to pause, to reflect, to adjust. They don't move through life reacting. They move through life remembering their values, remembering their patterns, remembering that silence doesn't always mean peace, and comfort doesn't always mean alignment. Self-examination also demands solitude, and that's something most people avoid. They fill their lives with noise, scrolling, talking, running, consuming, anything to avoid sitting with themselves. But the Stoics sought silence on purpose, not because it's trendy, but because it's necessary. Clarity grows in stillness, not in the chaos of other people's expectations. When you practice this consistently, you develop something rare: discernment. You stop being pulled into every drama. You stop repeating old cycles just because they're familiar. You start noticing the gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap, you choose differently. You stop justifying things that aren't good for you. You stop living for other people's applause, and you begin to shape your life like a sculptor, slowly, intentionally, and with presence. This is the kind of quiet power that makes a person unforgettable. They don't talk about how self-aware they are. You feel it in how they respond instead of react, in how they don't chase attention, but give it, in how they sit with discomfort instead of running from it. They aren't perfect, but they're awake. And in a world full of sleepwalkers, being awake is a kind of miracle. So if you want to become someone they regret letting go, not out of bitterness, but because your presence was rare, start here. Question your patterns, observe your motives, reflect, not to shame yourself, but to refine yourself, and then return to the world with more depth, more clarity, and more peace. Because at the end of the day, we don't become unforgettable by being flawless. We become unforgettable by being conscious. Number 7, they reclaim their freedom by not bending for others. There comes a point in life when you realize most of your suffering didn't come from being rejected. It came from shrinking yourself to be accepted. You lowered your voice so others wouldn't feel small. You watered down your truth so no one would walk away. And over time, you started living like a guest in your own soul. But unforgettable people do something radical. They stop bending, not out of rebellion, not to prove a point, but because they finally understand this. Every time you abandon yourself to keep someone else, you lose both. The Stoics called this freedom, not the ability to do whatever you want, but the strength to not be owned by anyone's expectations. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." That includes your choices, your voice, your truth. When you're constantly bending to fit someone else's comfort, you become a reflection, not a reality, and reflections fade. Real freedom begins when you stop negotiating your identity just to be tolerated, when you no longer ask, "Will they still like me if I say this?" and instead ask, "Will I still respect myself if I don't?" That shift changes everything, because now your life is led by integrity, not approval. Think of Alan Watts. He didn't fit neatly into any mold. He blended Eastern and Western philosophy with a voice that was poetic, unconventional, and sometimes polarizing. But he didn't bend to be digestible. He stayed rooted in what felt true. And today, his words reach millions, not because he conformed, but because he stayed whole. Now here's the paradox. The more you bend for others, the less they value you. But when you draw boundaries, not with arrogance, but with clarity, people notice. They may not always agree, but they respect the one thing most of the world has forgotten how to offer: a clear sense of self. Stoicism trains us to hold that clarity through discomfort. It doesn't ask us to be aggressive. It asks us to be immovable when it matters. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are pained by external things, it is not they that disturb you, but your own judgment of them." When someone pressures you to shrink, it's not their pressure that breaks you. It's your willingness to betray your center. And the cost of that betrayal is heavy. It's waking up with a life you don't recognize. It's surrounding yourself with people who only love the filtered version of you. It's smiling in rooms that drain you because you're afraid to walk out. But when you stop bending, you reclaim something priceless: alignment. You start speaking with conviction. You walk away when something isn't right. Not because you're cold, but because you're clear. And that kind of clarity, it filters everything. The wrong people leave, the right ones remain. Over time, you realize this isn't loneliness. It's freedom. The kind that lets you walk into a room without needing to be the most liked or agreeable. Because your energy no longer comes from being accepted. It comes from being authentic. Unforgettable people aren't remembered because they were agreeable. They're remembered because they were aligned. They knew when to be flexible and when to stand firm. They didn't try to be everything. They chose to be themselves. And that truth made others feel safe, challenged, or even uncomfortable, but never indifferent. So if you want to become unforgettable, not as a performance, but as a presence, start by reclaiming your boundaries. Stop twisting your truth into shapes that fit someone else's comfort zone. Say less, but mean it more. And don't just be brave in what you say. Be brave in what you walk away from. Because in the end, the most magnetic kind of person isn't the one who pleases everyone. It's the one who belongs fully to themselves. If they ever walk away, let them. But make sure what they walked away from was your truth, not your performance. Because when you live like this, authentically, deliberately, and without apology, you don't need to chase closure. Your presence becomes the lesson, your clarity becomes the echo, and your absence becomes the consequence. This isn't about revenge, it's about remembrance. About becoming the kind of person whose energy lingers long after the conversation ends. The kind of person they don't forget, not because you hurt them, but because you healed without needing them. So walk your path with quiet certainty, keep your peace sacred, and trust this. When you stop shrinking, you don't lose people, you lose illusions. And what's left behind is the kind of presence no one replaces. If this message grounded you, inspired you, or helped you reclaim a part of yourself, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Your path is just beginning.